Hi everyone, my name's Kat Boyd and welcome to ConterLive, your sceptical guide to the Scottish election. Ahead of the big day tomorrow, we are once again bringing you Scotland's sharpest thinkers on the big issues shaping this election. Before I introduce our guests for tonight, let me take a second to say that we're entirely supported by word of mouth and your generosity. So please take 1 second to help others find us by liking and subscribing to everything by Independence Live and Conter. You can find us at conter.co.uk, and if you're feeling extra generous, please back independent media by giving us a small monthly donation. Now, in 2014, many people said that Scottish politics had changed forever. And this wasn't just because of the referendum itself. It was because the process of building the Yes movement led to an unprecedented mobilisation in some of Scotland's most forgotten communities. Independence, we said at the time, was about social class, and the statistics reflected that working class communities were the most enthused and middle class professionals were actively hostile. Today, we're once again debating independence, but in this election, Conter's soon-to-be published analysis will show a dramatic shift in the political dynamics. In 2014, only 8% of the managerial professional elite backed independence in Scotland, less than 1/10. After Brexit, that figure rose to an extraordinary 61%. And by contrast, support amongst the poorest people in Scotland has slumped since Brexit, from 53% to just 45%. What's happened to Scotland's anti-establishment movement, and what are the implications for the future of working class politics in Scotland? And with socialist parties exiting the field, could this be the most middle class election in Scottish history? To discuss these questions tonight, I'm delighted to say that joining me are, firstly, Roz Foyer, General Secretary of the Scottish Trade Union Congress. Secondly, we have Bonnie Prince Bob, the independent candidate who has waged a one-man class war against Angus Robertson in Edinburgh Central. Thirdly, we have Ray Morell, a Conter Editorial board member and trade unionist in the aerospace industry. And lastly, we have writer and activist Darren McGarvey, who many of you might know from his BBC shows about social class. So welcome to you all. We've got a really packed agenda, so let's just get right into it. So Darren, I'm going to come to you first on some of your views on the election so far, because basically there's two schools of thought here, isn't there? It's either the most important election in history, where Scotland finally decides its destiny, or it's the most tedious election of all time. There hasn't been real door-to-door campaigning. There isn't really any competition. We all know who's going to come in first place. What are your thoughts on the election so far?
I mean, just viewing it in terms of through the lens of the mainstream coverage and not necessarily my own kind of left leanings and what I would prefer to see being discussed, I have been somewhat grudgingly impressed by some of the substance of the debates. Obviously, no one's ever going to talk about class. I don't think politicians have found a way to invoke that language successfully without being subject to very harsh criticism from certain parts of the media. So we use all these substitute phrases, social mobility, the drug death crisis, the attainment gap, which are all synonyms for class inequality. I think that some of the parties, inequality has been a big theme. Although there is never that interconnectivity between the different issues. They're always isolated in discussion and focused on as single issues, when actually they're all part of a broader trend where we see an acceleration in class inequality and all of the problems that entails.
Thanks, Darren. Now, Roz, I want to come to you on this as well, because many might see this election as being quite good for trade unions and workers more broadly. There's lots of spending commitments, lots of talk of green jobs, a 4-day working week and so on. Do you see life getting easier for Scotland's workers in the next parliamentary term?
Well, Sadly, unless we actually start to press our demands a bit more and, you know, build a bit more worker power, I don't see things getting any easier for working class people in Scotland and you know, the vast majority of our members. We've certainly done our best to press our demands and raise workers' voices in this election around issues like fair pay. The reality is that many of Scotland's workers that have been keeping this society going are chronically underpaid. You know, the people that have actually went out and looked after us are on poverty pay, and that is something that's not good enough. But until we build a strong movement that's going to demand change and put the kind of pressure on politicians that needs to be put on them, then we're not going to get, you know, an overnight success. There's a lot of money being thrown about, a lot of promises being made. But when you really look at the sort of investment needed to transform our economy and close the gap between the richest and the poorest, we're not touching, you know, we're not even scratching the surface of those sorts of changes. So I think we've actually got a lot of work to do, because I do think that after the sacrifices people have made and the way people have been treated in this pandemic, you know, 10,000 deaths in Scotland, 150,000 deaths across the UK, many of which could have been prevented if they hadn't put money before people. I think actually we need to grab this moment now, and we actually need to get people angry and use that anger and get organised to force change.
Thanks, Roz. Ray, you're a trade unionist on the ground in the aerospace industry. So you've got a sort of different perspective from a lot of people. What's your take on this election? Do you think that things are going to get better, or are they going to get worse for working people in Scotland?
Well, just briefly, really, I mean, this election is one, I can't remember another election that's been so uninspiring in my life, to be quite honest with you. I mean, working class people, I think, are really disengaged for this election. It's not just because of the pandemic. I think it's because they look at Holyrood and they think, what is this going to achieve for me? All these policies and the manifestos are motherhood and apple pie, right? People know that Labour, when they were running Holyrood, now the SNP, supported by the Greens, who approve all the austerity budgets, they're not going to deliver on these promises, and it's going to be very much more the same. So the problem is that I think I read in the paper about 50% of people aren't even going to bother voting, right? Because they can't see a reason to vote. So that's the first point. But I think secondly, on the constitutional question, it is important, this election, because we are likely to see a pro-independence majority. And that will then lead to a constitutional crisis, which I think opens up a space for working class people in the movement to engage in that crisis and try and shift things in a positive direction.
Thanks, Ray. Bob, I'm going to come to you now because you're a candidate. You're the only candidate on our first pre-election type show that we've been doing. So you're the only candidate. You're a candidate in the Edinburgh Central constituency, and really all the videos that I've seen you do, you've based your campaign around highlighting class inequality in Edinburgh and critiquing Angus Robertson. So what is it about Angus Robertson that's convinced you to stand? And how's your campaign been going so far?
I felt that Angus Robertson just typified the sort of the careerism of neoliberal politics in terms of what we've got now. He's just a kind of one of the accusations that you know, I called him a carpetbagger because he is a carpetbagger, and there was a lot of issues with this. They seem to be arguing about. But Angus Robertson went to school here, and how dare you call him this? But Angus Robertson went to Morrell for 17 years of his career. So if he's not a carpetbagger when he was in Morrell, what is he here? You know what I mean? It's like, so to me, I'm like, well, which is it, Gadget? You know what I mean? You're either a carpetbagger there or here. Do you know what I mean? So he's just kind of, to me, it's this sense, there was a sense of entitlement. He thought he was just going to come in and take this seat from Davidson, from the Tories, you know, and it just really, it kind of was the catalyst for a lot of problems that I've got with the way that our political establishment is, and the political class specifically. And I live in Edinburgh Central. I actually live in like one of the poorest parts in Edinburgh Central, in a really pretty rough part of the town. And he was kind of, he was there just the other day there, and I thought, it was a wee bit of a publicity stunt, but I just thought, I'm going to just chase them away. So I turned up with a sound system and kind of chased them off the patch, because I just thought, what are you doing here? What is it that you can do for this area? You don't have any real relationship to this area. You don't really understand what's going on with this area. And I just wanted to make a real provocation, basically, to the political class, because I have a big problem with the political class, and I don't think anyone kind of represents that better than Robertson, just as a careerist member of the political class,
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of a provocation.
Well, it kind of needs to be done, It's kind of some people might view it in different terms, but it's I don't have the budget of a party. I don't have the budget. I don't have the media coverage. I don't have these things. So I've got to think of other ways in which I can keep my campaign, keep my thing happening. Some people might think some stuff is a little bit, publicity stunt or whatever, but you just have to kind of deploy what you've got to deploy in the Overton window, if you like, of the time that you've got to kind of get your message across. So it might not be the sort of thing that I would do all the time, but I think under the circumstances, different approaches for different situations.
I'm just going to ask you a quick follow-up question on that, just based on what you've said. So you're standing as an independent, and this is obviously we're obviously going to be discussing social class in a very broad way. But part of that's about class representation. And I just wonder, if there was a serious, organised left-wing party in Scotland, would you stand for that, or would you always stand as an independent?
I don't know. I probably would stand as an independent if I was going to stand in that capacity. I mean, I'm not into political careerism. I think that we have to attack political careerism. I think this is a problem. I think that we need to start thinking about a different way of the type of political representation that we have. Political tenure is one of the issues that we've got, and we've kind of got an electorate so either partisan or apathetic and inured to the way that everything is, that there's a sense that there's an opportunity you can get in there and you can build a pretty comfortable long-term career for yourself. If you think about it, there's never not a place for a football analogy, right? So let's use a football analogy. If you if you had the same football team for 5 years, right, and they just did however they did, there would be an issue. They wouldn't just be invading the pitch, they'd be invading the boardroom, people would be going mental. So it's this sense of why is it that politicians can just kind of get into this position and then they're kind of untouchable, and they're behind the party machinery, they're behind that kind of faceless organisation of the party, they're kind of unaccountable. And I think there's a strange appetite in Scotland potentially for something different because of the politicisation of Indie Ref, and that's kind of what you were saying at the start of the programme as well. I think that there was a participatory element that occurred in 2014. In fact, I'll actually go further, right? I'll say part of this anger and sort of, part of my explosive sort of explosion onto the stage here is basically like, why should I get politicised in the way that I did in 2014 for a bunch of PMC neoliberals to just mop up everything and just turn it into a corporatocracy? Do you know what I mean? Like, do one, you know what I mean? I didn't swear, but it's like
I'm just going to move on a little bit, right? I did enjoy your football analogy, even though I rolled my eyes. And Ray's been very involved in football lads and lasses against fascism. So I'm sure Ray will have some football analogies for us as well. So listen, I just want to move on to our next section, just so we can get through on everything. Now, Darren, on class politics and the theme of this show, you recently made an excellent documentary series for the BBC on the politics of class, and to any of our viewers who haven't seen it yet, I really recommend that you check it out. It's far better than any of the mainstream coverage that we get of politics, especially of the election. Now, recently I've heard a lot of people saying that class is an outdated concept. It's not as relevant as it used to be, this argument. And there is certainly an absence of class politics in this election. So is this absence a reflection on the reality? Is it truly an outdated concept? How important do you think class is in Scotland today?
Oh, it's absolutely fundamental for people require a language that helps them to accurately identify the context in which they're situated. And I think for all of the potential problems of the language of class, and obviously some of the ways that it can be applied depending on how far left you want to go or how angry you want to get, ultimately the analysis itself remains fundamentally sound. And without it, then it means that we can be kind of tricked or gaslit into thinking that the problems that we're experiencing are a result of something else, or we can fall into the traps that politicians can present us when they announce flagship policies which don't really address fundamental issues that we're facing. The thing about class for me is there are, just to quickly link back to what Roz was talking about and what everyone's been talking about, there are movements developing across many issues in Scotland, and they're currently all sort of segregated from one another, but a lot of different groups are becoming politicised. Policing is under scrutiny, the drug laws, decriminalisation, how drug addicts are treated, access to rehabilitation is all under scrutiny. We have a lot of activism around trade unions. We have a lot of stuff around housing. These things are all interconnected. It just takes the right kind of people to come together to find a way to cross the streams of these things. And then you're talking about something that's pretty significant. And in Scotland, despite the fact that our political class is quite removed, we have the benefit of proximity here in a way that we don't to the Westminster establishment. In Scotland, you can very much reach out and touch your politicians, and they can feel your presence if you go about it the right way. So I think that the language of class is what will help to bring a lot of these disparate movements together, even just temporarily, to make the presence more palpable for politicians.
I think that's really interesting, Darren. And you mentioned like some of those movements that are happening in Scotland right now. And in this episode, we're going to look at some of the SNP's objective failures on the policy front. And like you said, these are all synonyms for class inequality, lack of green jobs, drugs, deaths, the attainment gap, gentrification, lack of social housing. They're all synonyms, as you say. And I just wanted to get your view on one of them, because Scotland has been labelled the drug death capital of Europe. And beyond the absolute tragedy of that situation, of the people involved and friends and families who are affected by that, what does this say about Scotland's so-called progressive credentials? Do you think that things will get better in the next term? It took a long time for the government to take responsibility for this crisis.
Yes, and partly the reason that they took the responsibility is because we were highly organised, and also we can act autonomously within our movement. So when the drug death statistics were announced, then some of us saw an opportunity to go after a government minister. And while other people in the movement thought, well, what's the point in that? The point is sometimes you have to demonstrate your power. You have to demonstrate that you understand the political landscape, that you see a vulnerability, and that you will take action and exploit it when the opportunity presents itself. And that was a highly successful aspect of the campaign that has grown up around the drug deaths. I mean, the recovery movement splits into two. You've got people who are part of the kind of established drug sector, and then you have people who are have lived experience or are professional in some other way, but believe that there isn't enough emphasis on the solution, too much pain management, harm reduction stuff that often leaves a lot of people sitting. But there are analogies with what's going on in the drug sector and everywhere else. I think the lessons that we have about class in relation to the drug issue is that groups who are marginalised, who are persecuted and have no political advocacy are always the first to be discarded when it comes to making decisions about where resources are spent and what sort of issues are talked about every day. Think about how our whole awareness of ourselves and our proximity to others and the virus and our vulnerability and the sense of community spirit that happened just because politicians decided to give us permission during the pandemic to help each other, to look in on our neighbour, to be considerate of one another. And so suddenly this aspect of society and community becomes really important when over-mortgaged households are threatened, when businesses are threatened. And we all know from our own experience that actually it's essential. The idea of the individual society is a lie. And so when you get right down there, I think that eventually politicians are going to have to contend with class as an issue, whether they want to talk about it or not. And I think it's our job to just make sure that it's always somewhere on the agenda.
Thanks, Darren. Now, Roz, I'm going to just come to you on this, because some of what Darren's talking about like politicians are going to have to reckon with class at some stage or another. I think it's really interesting in the trade union movement. You're a working class woman. You're now the leader of the STUC. And I think that that's a really important development for the trade union movement in Scotland, to have working class women in leadership roles. But it's not quite enough, is it? I just wanted to see what your experience of class in Scotland has been, and how important you see the trade unions in taking some of those class issues forward.
Well, if I can just start at the point of saying, I've been in this role now for just over a year. So, you know, my first day at work was the day we sent the staff home, because we were going into lockdown. And so it's been very much in the context of COVID that I've been doing the role. But I remember coming into it and being very aware of things. You know, I actually found watching Darren's documentary very, very personal for me, because at a point when I'd been thrust into the media, you know, I was aware of things like my accent and stuff like that. And I remember the awful comments that Piers Morgan when you were on Newsnight, Darren, and being absolutely outraged. But I also remember just saying, I'm going to be myself. I'm going to embrace who I am, because this is what it's about. You know, this is what my role's about. It's about building working class power, actually, is what our movement should be for. And, you know, at every opportunity I try and talk about class, actually, as part of our narrative. It's our people, it's our communities, it's our jobs, it's our futures, you know. And these, it's very important that we start to embrace that, because I couldn't agree more that what the ruling class has done very effectively is divide us. We get divided upon all sorts of things, including the Constitution at times, you know. But at the end of the day, we're going to have to get beyond some of those divisions if we're going to exercise our power properly.
Thanks, Roz. I want to bring in some of the STUC's work that's gone on recently. So the STUC's talked about the green jobs crisis and the betrayal of workers over issues like BIFAB and what happened around BIFAB. And the STUC's also released a report talking about a potential boom in green jobs in the future. Are you confident that we can see a Green New Deal under a likely SNP-dominated government?
No, I'm not confident that we will see that, and I'm not confident that we would perhaps see it under, you know, an SNP government, or indeed, you know, in the case, certainly not in the care of the UK government. I think the SNP has not put the sort of money forward that we need to see invested. We need two things if we're going to see a green jobs boom, and it is capable. We've done research that shows that we could have 360,000 high quality, unionised, sustainable, good jobs in Scotland across all sorts of sectors. You know, we could be putting workers into transport, high quality public transport. We could be delivering free transport. We could be looking at green and retrofitting people's houses so that we tackle fuel poverty, as well as giving people good quality jobs. We could be putting money into our care sectors, because that's an important part of green infrastructure, is the whole care, and really looking at how we transition our energy properly and deliver a proper just transition with a proper supply chain, manufacturing supply chain here in Scotland. If you look at what happened in BIFAB, they told us that we'd be the Saudi Arabia renewables. They have given away £5 billion worth of renewables contracts, and we end up with, at the very last gaff, after a huge union campaign, we end up with 8 jackets for wind turbines, when we could have had 250 jackets for wind turbines getting produced here in Scotland. So it's actually scandalous that over 10 years they weren't able to get that right and have a proper strategy to train people, to get the right investment in place and to be able to compete for those jobs. We weren't even on the playing field in terms of competing for those jobs. So something is going badly wrong unless we fundamentally rethink how we do things. And that does mean, you know, making sure that when companies come in or get any sort of public support, that they're delivering jobs here in Scotland and that they're delivering good unionised jobs here in Scotland. So all of these things can be done with the political will. We can borrow money right now and actually put the level of investment in we need, and we can deliver public ownership and more democratic forms of ownership. But if we just sit back and leave it to the markets and think business is going to do this for us, then we will make the same mistakes again and again and again. This needs big government and it needs money and investment.
Thanks, Roz. Now, Ray, you work in manufacturing and know some of the difficulties. Do you think that the government is doing enough to provide jobs? What should be happening instead? How can working class people force the hand of government?
No, I mean, I agree with Roz's comments about the Scottish government. There's no question about it. They're talking the talk, but they're not walking the walk. The gap between what the Scottish government says that its agenda is over the Saudi Arabia renewables and all the rest of it, and what's actually happening in practice, it's a massive gap. So I think the paper for the STUC is welcome, but I think the problem is that we need to address some of the concerns and issues, that the barriers, if you like, to a Green New Deal and just transition that exists within the Labour movement. Because, you know, I've been campaigning for defence diversification and a just transition for many years inside Unite and its predecessor unions. And I mean, there's a perception amongst a lot of senior reps that green jobs don't pay. And we get decent wages working in aerospace, the automotive industry, steel and whatever. But what's missing from that analysis is that these jobs are in decline, and they have been for many, many years. They're shrinking, as they are in defence as well. And so the status quo isn't an option for our members, our families, communities, or for the planet. Now, I think that's the issue that we really need to start to pick up. I mean, this idea that dirty jobs are good jobs, there's a lot of confusion in the movement. So, for example, in Unite, you've got policy supporting a just transition, but on the other hand, supporting a balanced energy approach, which is really just a cover for supporting continued dirty industries. And in reality, what wins out is the status quo, the dirty industries, if you like, and the support for that. And I think we have to get to why that's the case, because I see it all the time, senior reps and reps arguing the same arguments that we hear for big business. And that's because we've got this partnership which exists in a lot of these industries, in power, in steel, in aerospace. I mean, we've lost thousands of jobs in recent months in aerospace. That's despite having policies for a just transition and a Green New Deal. Nothing was done to save a load of their jobs. And that's because a lot of the reps and the officers still buy the employer's arguments that, you know, what's good for business is good for jobs. And so we need to challenge the partnership. We need to challenge the reps. And be honest, there are examples of this happening positively. I mean, myself and Roz were on the Edinburgh May Day thing just on Saturday there. And it was somebody who's done some work in the North Sea, and they've surveyed North Sea oil workers. Now, most of them hadn't heard a just transition, which says a lot about the trade unions, Unite and the RMT, and the fact that they haven't been engaging with the membership, right? But when it was explained to them that this just transition, you know, what it would lead to in the way of new jobs, skilled jobs, and the rates of pay and whatever else, people were supportive of that. And so you can see how, if we engage with workers, you can actually win them and challenge the backward arguments that exist. But the other one is BIFAB. It came up earlier, right? And I want to bring a positive example out of BIFAB, because people forget that when the closure was announced, there was an explosion of anger. There was the occupation of the site, and the Labour movement rallied round. We had the demonstrations and the like. And very quickly, the SNP, the Scottish government, backed off and we got the reprieve. And that shows you the key to transforming this. If we can win the workers, win the communities, and the rest of the Labour movement can come behind the just transition, you can see how it's possible. The Scottish Government aren't going to move in that direction unless there's pressure from below. And what I think the STUC and the Labour movement need to do is engage with the climate campaigns and start to get the workers who are affected involved, because that's how we build a powerful movement.
And Ray, thanks for that. I mean, I do think that there is a bright kind of horizon for the trade union movement in Scotland, because I hear more and more people talking about workers' power, organising the 99%, like talking in those big organising terms, and I think that is a really exciting thing. One of the other big issues that the Scottish Government, the SNP government, have failed on is about social housing in general. Rent controls. There was big campaigns around rent controls during the lockdown, during the pandemic, for having better rights for renters during this time. But Bob, I'm going to come to you on that point, because you've talked a lot about the issue of gentrification, which is completely linked to housing and social housing. You've talked a lot about gentrification in your constituency. The first video, when I sort of first came across you, was about gentrification in Edinburgh, about cheap student flats, prime real estate. What I'd like to know from you is what you would want to see in the next term from the Scottish Government around issues like gentrification and public space.
Well, they need to sort of make a stand about that. The bottom line is that Edinburgh has become inaccessible for the locals, for the people that were always part of the city. It's not affordable. It's just not affordable for people who live in the outlying schemes or whatever to come in and spend a day in the town. It's just economically unviable. And I actually caught up with Adam McVeigh the other day, and kind of like badgered him a bit in the links about this, and I asked him about this. I was going like, look, it's not affordable. If you live in Muirhouse or you live in one of the schemes or whatever, it's just, you're not going to do it. You're not going to come into the city. And so who's the city for, And he started to come out with all these bizarre kind of like, these responses were all these bizarre kind of, well, we've got this plan and that plan and all the rest of it. And I was saying like, well, what's that got to do with somebody that like, they've got a family, or the town is no longer accessible to people. And, one of the ways maybe they could start to do something is like, let's get the minimum wage up, have a minimum wage in Edinburgh, like do something like that, let's start having a campaign for a higher minimum wage. And also, there must be things that can be done. I mean, people say this is maybe a council issue, but I think it's a governmental issue as well. I think this is just the ideology that permeates the entire governmental and the entire political system, essentially, in the way that they are. I mean, just to go back to the point you were talking about there, because I'm not really plugged into the trade union side of things in that respect, but one of the things that, as I'm an artist, I make video art, I make provocative art to try to provoke people to think about things in different ways, and really in many, many ways, the thing that needs to be increased is class consciousness. It's class consciousness that needs to increase across the scale, because it's only with class consciousness can people actually start to mobilise against the problem, which is capital and neoliberal capitalism. And until people actually start to talk about what that is and how that is affecting everything, and how the political class are essentially just the servants of capital, then we can't really have an effective opposition. So as an artist, it's kind of incumbent on me to try to find ways that I can start to provoke conversations and get people thinking about what is class consciousness, why is it important, and why do we need it? It doesn't matter what class you're from. It's like there's a battle occurring here, and it's basically, the way I see it, is between capital consciousness and class consciousness. And really that's the thing. Whether it's about social housing or whether it's about jobs or the minimum wage or anything, it all comes down to this sort of binary line, really, for me, So I think that the issue with housing in Edinburgh, I mean, I know people that have been on Edindex trying to get a house for their families for like years practically, and they're still not got suitable accommodation, so they're going to have to move away from the city. Who's responsible for this? There has to be some sort of like, there seems to be a complete detachment from who the city's for and who lives in the city, essentially. So that's what the work is, or the art that I try to produce is about, provoking these conversations,
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I think we do need a shift in class consciousness, and I think that there are changing points in class consciousness at the moment. Some of that's around class representation. I think that we're really clearly seeing in Scotland and Northern England that voters have rejected a lot of their traditional allegiance to the Labour Party. So, Ray, I'm probably going to bring you in here on this question, because I think that lots of people now see Scottish Labour as a kind of part of the political elite. We've had the election of Keir Starmer and Anna Sarwar as party leaders. It's not changed that perception. But there's also quite a lot of young left-wing candidates standing for the Labour Party around the country. We had Kieran O'Neill on the first episode of ConterLive. He's a young working class guy standing in Maryhill for the Labour Party. So I do think it's interesting that you still have this kind of like post-Corbyn type of candidate. Do you think there's any chance for Labour to win back working class support, or is it just no longer possible to be the party of the working class now?
I mean, I think this has got to be a pivotal moment for working class representation. I mean, it looks likely that Starmer hasn't stopped the decline in Labour's fortunes, but accelerated them, and we'll find that out tomorrow. So there's going to have to be a really honest assessment. I mean, for many years in Unite, the question of Labour funding was, continuing to fund poor millions into Labour while being treated as the embarrassing relative was becoming really difficult for Labour supporters to justify. But that changed when Jeremy Corbyn became the leader. And, activists across the movement came out to support Jeremy. I mean, I've never been in the Labour Party, but in 2017 and in 2019, I went out to campaign for him. And many other people did as well, because they identified with the transformative agenda that he was trying to push through. But I think people could see, certainly in the intervening period, 2017 to 2019, that he was a prisoner in the Labour machine. And that I think he halted the decline in support, but it began to accelerate again. And what we're seeing is that process continue under Keir Starmer. I mean, people say that Corbyn lost the votes in the Red Wall. But, in 2017, he actually was turning that situation around. It was only when it became clear that the machine and all the rest of it were doing him in that he started to lose support in these areas. So I think these people need to look closer to home for the answer as to why it is that Corbyn lost. Now, I think the problem is that many people on the left and in the Labour Party are drawing the wrong conclusions. I mean, they think that because Corbyn won, maybe we can win again. But the reality is the Labour establishment will never, ever let somebody like that win again. And I know that there's good young people standing in this election. In fact, the candidate in Edinburgh Central, and there'll be others as well, young Labour Party members who are involved in anti-cuts work, doing a lot of good stuff. But the problem is, if they're elected into the Scottish Parliament, they'll be under manners. They'll be forced to toe the line. They won't be allowed to express their opposition to cuts. When they're in Holyrood, they'll be told quite clearly what their role is. And so they're prisoners, just like Corbyn was, prisoners in the Labour Party bureaucracy. And so that's the real problem that we face. And I think the good people who are in the Labour Party are in a cul-de-sac. And I think a vote for any of these candidates at the moment is really a bit of a dead end. And we need to begin thinking about how we start that process again, rebuilding working class representation, a representation that articulates the concerns and the struggles of ordinary working people. Sorry, but that's where I think we are at the moment. I
mean, I think we're seeing some of the how Keir Starmer's getting on, shall we say, in Hartlepool. I think we're seeing some of how that's playing out, those shifting allegiances. And I mean, apart from yourself, Bob, he is a constant source of political fascination to me. I saw him declare that he was indeed a human being on television the other day. Wonderful stuff. Darren, I'm going to come to you because you've not heard from you for a bit. I think it's pretty easy to point score against the Labour Party. But after 2014, lots of people have said Scottish politics. I mean, I said it, Scottish politics will never be the same again after 2014. But to be honest, I think that the SNP are repeating a lot of the mistakes that New Labour made, taking working class voters for granted. Do you think the spirit of 2014 is still alive?
I think that the SNP buck most of the trends associated with long-term centrist government, and it's because of the constitutional fold in our politics. So a lot of people can explain away in their mind, and I've been one of them from time to time, that while you could say I disagree with almost everything the SNP does, and I hate the way they do it, and they make New Labour look like a fucking paddle steamer with the slickness of their fucking operation. Excuse my language. But at the same time, they're going to deliver. They've got more chance than anyone else to deliver independence and to kind of. They're a bit of a two-headed monster. Up here they're in government, down in London they're in opposition. The positions are very hard to reconcile. You need to be heavily emotionally invested in the myth of the SNP to not see that for what it is. But in just pure pragmatic terms, what else are you going to do? I think in terms of, it's interesting here, we're discussing the Labour Party like it's a corporation being liquidated almost, is it? It's very sad. But I hear similar discussions occurring in the United States in relation to the Democratic Party. There are obvious parallels all the way through for the last 30 odd years. I do think that what Corbyn represented for a lot of people was this chance for the left to unify and take a big shortcut through a lot of hard work that needs to be done. There was that sort of promise, well, maybe it can just be some kind of, random political event where somehow a genuinely left-wing person wins. And obviously, in order to get to Downing Street, you've got to make so many compromises that you're going to disillusion half of your support on the way to power anyway. So I think that the way forward really for any kind of left-wing project is a new party or a new movement. I think Corbyn himself was much better suited to the leader of a social movement than a politician. I think his instincts were more in line with a social movement. He commands crowds at rallies in the way that the leader of a social movement would do. I think the minute that you put him in with the, all PR people and media people and all of that stuff, I just don't think he was wired up that way, and it really showed. Generally, I don't know if it's because I'm getting older. I don't know what it is, but I'm able to sort of operate in both of these spheres. Where on one hand, I have a highly idealistic view of how I think the world should be, and I don't think that'll ever leave me. But I can also see that in Scotland, we have it a wee bit better than some of the working class folk down in England, where there's definitely a lot of divergence going on just now. And also generally the harshness of austerity down in England has been a lot worse. Mm. And I think that that's all reflected in some of the more mean-spirited aspects of the politics down there.
Thanks, Darren. I definitely agree with some of your points there. We're coming towards the end of the show, so I know you have to leave us sharpish. So before you go, I want to ask you what you think is going to happen after Thursday. What's your final prediction? What do you hope to happen, but what do you think will happen?
Just for me?
It's for you.
All right, nice one. I think Sturgeon's going to pull it off. I think this all hanging on a knife edge thing has actually worked in her favour, because there's a lot of people who might have been considering doing something quite maverick with their votes. And then this idea that the SNP might not win a majority is sort of regimenting their thinking a wee bit and thinking, actually, when the push comes to shove, I need to back the Yes campaign. So I think that it's a clean sweep. The Greens, I think, are going to do well. And I'll be interested to see what happens with Alba. I'm not into the leadership of Alba, but I know that it's difficult to ascribe a single character or intent to a lot of the people that are organising around Alba, and I don't want to make judgments about that.
Thanks very much. Very interesting stuff. If you need to leave, then if we run a little bit over, then you've got 5 more minutes. Magic. Roz, I'm going to come to you next to see if you wanted to pick up on either of the points that have been made about the Labour Party and working class representation, but I also really want to know, what are your final predictions and what are your hopes and fears for next week, and as it unfolds, what do you think's on the cards?
Well, my biggest fear and probably my prediction is that nothing's really going to change. I think the parties will send similar numbers back than what they've got now. And if that's inconclusive, it'll be like Groundhog Day. This whole debate around the referendums and when we have it, etc., is just going to rattle on and dominate everything. And that's my sort of prediction plus fear in some respects. But I do have to say, just thinking about the previous question too, isn't it sad that someone like Corbyn isn't cut out for party politics? Isn't it sad that we need to have this certain type of person that does stupid photo shoots and makes great, no offence, Bob, but you know what I mean, it makes great insights and I sat and open the Herald every morning and I see them all doing really daft things and I just think that must be a nightmare. And, we need politics that's a bit more than that. Let's get back to politics that is about the issues. It almost is a wee bit strange the way they're all saying what a great job Anas Sarwar's doing. He is doing a good job, don't get me wrong, and he's coming across well, but it's almost as though the mainstream media are relieved to finally not have a socialist leading the Labour Party, and so they're just all talking through that relief, and that I find it says something really disturbing about our society, and we're going to have to get away from that.
Yeah, great point, Roz. I'm fed up of seeing politicians whose parties have routinely backed austerity sitting in big deck chairs thinking it's all a laugh. Totally agree. So next, Ray, predictions, hopes, fears. Are we just going to look at the sort of never-ending referendum debate? What's your take on what's going to happen? Who are you going to vote for?
This is the first time I've really struggled since Tony Blair was leading us into wars and whatever else, struggled to find out or work out who I'm going to vote for. But I think voting's not the most important thing, really. I mean, I think we're going to have a constitutional crisis after the election results come out, assuming we get the Indian majority. And that can be resolved one of two ways. It can be, as Roz says, a dragged out process with the SNP and the Greens, first asking and then getting told they're not getting the referendum and then going through the legal processes and it dragging on and on and on. And if that's the way it goes, people will get desperate, they'll get dejected, they'll become demoralised. And in that situation, you can see how the forces of reaction will get confident. They feed on despair, they feed on people feeling like there's nothing they can do. And we've already seen a wee bit of that in the movement. We see these reactionary ideas and the like gaining some currency. And I would argue it's because the left and the Labour movement isn't really playing a role in the independence movement. And I think that's something we need to address, because we can actually intervene in this constitutional crisis. I think we'll have a window of opportunity. I mean, for example, Darren spoke about the movement being fragmented, loads of positive movements existing, right, but they're not being united. I mean, I was on the Black Lives Matter sort of Kill the Bill demonstration last weekend. And, these people are pro-independence, but they're not on the all under one banner demonstrations. And they're pro-independence because they can see that Boris Johnson wants to bring these police powers up into Scotland. He wants to break through the devolved settlement and all the rest of it. And so you can see how there's an alliance could be built between all under one banner, Kill the Bill, even Black Lives Matters and all these other groups. But I think the problem we face is that we're split. And I think we have to work out how we overcome these divisions. And I got thinking about this when I was looking at some of the historical examples. See, back in 1992, when we had a similar situation, the Tories had won, we were all desperate, Scotland had voted the other way and the like. The STUC managed to pull together the Scotland United campaign, which led to a massive demonstration in Edinburgh, demonstrations in Glasgow, led by the STUC, which really led to the devolved settlement, right? Now, people talk about John Smith being responsible for that, but the reality is it was the STUC, the Labour movement, pulling wider civil society together to build devolution. Now, we all know there's problems with the devolved settlement, and I think we need to move on for that. But you can see how the Labour movement, how the STUC could play a positive role in that. And I think, if I know that the STUC have taken a positive position now on Scotland's right to self-determination and they support a referendum, I think we need to argue for that throughout the Labour movement and try and get the Labour movement on these demonstrations, heading them up and giving them a class composition, because that will bring new power to the independence movement.
Thanks, Ray. So last on this is our candidate, Bob, Bonnie Prince Bob. What are your predictions? Are you going to win? I saw your odds have been slashed, haven't they?
They have indeed, yeah. This is quite impressive. This is kind of a victory in itself. It's kind of a victory in itself. Say again, sorry, Kat.
I was just saying you've gone from 500 to 1 to 25 to 1.
Yes, indeed, yeah, which is pretty impressive, I have to say. I kind of agree with what Roz and Ray was saying there. I think that we're looking at more of the same, essentially, from after Thursday. You know, I would imagine it'll be more of the same. In terms of whether I'm going to win or not, that's down to the people of Edinburgh Central. So, you know, go out there and do your best for me tomorrow. You know, I think my position, if I was there, you know, I think it would be interesting to say the least. You know, I think we've got a very sort of like bland political class. It doesn't really matter what party they're in. They've almost become kind of clerical. You know what I mean? They've almost become in this strange sort of like, you know, unaccountable kind of way that they are. And it's, you know, this is the problem. You must forgive me. I'm extremely tired. This whole thing has been extremely taxing and exhausting, the whole experience. But I think that my problem with Scottish politics, with the independence movement, and with the dominance of the SNP and where they are, I do see the independence movement as not being particularly politicised. It's pretty much a one-issue thing. It's about independence, and there's not really an awful lot of thinking going on about what the politics of that are. And back to the class consciousness question, I really feel that if the working class members of the independence movement were more class conscious, or had class consciousness about them in a way that they just simply don't at present, I don't think it'd be the SNP that they were throwing their weight behind. I think there would be a different movement that was occurring there, and that's probably where the opportunity should be, really, or that's where we should be thinking about what can happen here. You know, we're going to have more of this. We're not going to have I don't see us having an IndyRef in any short-term future. And I don't see anything particularly huge changes in terms of the way that the political landscape is in Scotland. But I do think that those people who are desperate for independence need to be thinking about who it is that's going to deliver that independence, and because if you think about it, there's a lot of excitement within the SNP, people that support the SNP, about the fact that Tories are now voting for the SNP and all the rest of it. Like, this isn't something to be excited about. This is something to be concerned about. You know, if Tories are now joining your political party, then you need to be having a think about that, right? You need to be thinking, why are these type of people interested in the political party that you're supporting when you're working class? It's like that's not going to work out well for you. That's as simple as that, you know. So that's pretty much where I see it. And as for tomorrow, you know, I'm putting my faith in my people of the city, like, you know, in the capital, like, you know.
Thanks so much, Bob, and thanks Roz and Ray and Darren, who's also had to leave us. So we've come to the end of today's show. Thanks to you all for joining us. After such a great show tonight, you'll be glad to know this won't be our last episode. So whether you're uncorking some champagne or drowning your sorrows, you can join us next Wednesday for the wonderful election post-mortem session, or should I say post-match analysis. We'd like to take this opportunity to thank Independence Live for their technical support and hosting this show. Without them, this just wouldn't have been possible. You can keep up to date with this event and many more that Independence Live run by subscribing to their YouTube channel below or checking out their website, independencelive.net. In addition to this, I want to thank our guests for being part of the discussion today. Voters in Edinburgh Central can find Bonnie Prince Bob's name on the ballot paper tomorrow, and you can find his channel on YouTube. Please follow our other guests on Twitter. I hope their handles will be flashing up along the bottom of the screen now. And finally, thank you to Conter for organising this event. Remember that Conter tries to bring you the best guests and insights, but we're not funded by millionaires. If you can afford it, please support Conter with a monthly donation. You can do that and view a lot more of our content at conter.co.uk. Thank you all and good night until next week.